everyone. Welcome back to our show. Today we have Kelsey McCormick here with us to talk about one of my favorite marketing strategies, and that's private podcasts. So this case study is really juicy. We're actually going to combine two different launches, one that happened in mid-December through January, and then one that was much more recent, actually April, May. So you're really getting these stats in real time. Before we introduce the case study though, I would love for Kelsey to share her Cubicle to CEO story. So Kelsey, tell us, what was that catalyst that helped you leap into entrepreneurship?
Hey, Ellen. First of all, thanks so much for having me. This is one of my absolute favorite podcasts, so it's so exciting to be here. So my Cubicle to CEO story, I definitely came up in the kind of open office, like open plan office time. So it was kind of a cubicle. Did you ever have like an open plan office?
Oh, I wish. I mean, in some ways, I guess like technically we were in a pretty open room, but it was definitely blocks of cubicles when I was in the corporate.
Like blocked off.
Yeah. So like, I mean, if you're sitting down, you couldn't really see anything except for like the person right next to you or like diagonal from you. And also we worked in the lower floor of a building where my side of cubicles, like the wall that we were next to, didn't have any windows. And so it really felt more dungeony. It was very like fluorescent lights and not at all, I'm sure, what you're describing right now.
Yeah, I'd say I had that experience very briefly when I worked at Warner Brothers, when I, like right out of college. I remember that like I used to kind of decorate the sides of the cubicle to make it feel a little bit more fun, but it was still pretty horrible. And then I worked in content marketing in the music industry. So that's when I had like a cool office. It was very open plan, still cubicle-esque, but I worked there for about 10 years in content marketing in the music industry and in the entertainment industry as well before deciding to start my own thing around when I turned 30 and had a baby.
I love that. I love that it coincided with such like a momentous chapter in your personal life, both, you know, turning 30, which I just turned 30 like a month ago. So it feels very fresh to me.
Yay, welcome.
Welcome to the club, right? Thank you. And also, of course, becoming a mother. So that's really exciting that that happened during that time of your life. And I would love to know just like one little add-on before we get into the case study, because that is unique that it kind of happened right around those milestones. Was it those milestones that pushed you to decide to try your own thing, or was that just more coincidental, not necessarily related to your decision?
It was 100% because of when I always wanted to start my own thing. You're a little bit younger than me, so I'm not sure if you quite came up in the same girl bossy era as I did, but when I had graduated, I was reading like all the books about like doing your own thing and like multi-hyphen method and all of these books around doing your own thing, but I just never really had the confidence to do it in my 20s. I also had a really cool job with very cool perks. Like I was backstage at Coachella. I was like going to all these concerts for free. It was very much like tied up in my identity as a person, and all my friends worked in that industry. So leaving just felt like such a impossible thing. But when I became a mother, I just couldn't see a path. You know, when you like look around yourself in your cubicle and you're like, there's literally no one here that I can relate to or that I would want their job, and that's like the only upward trajectory here, so I have to figure something else out. And that's kind of when I started my creativity journey and Coming Up Roses, which has had a million different versions of it, but now is kind of a space for creative entrepreneurs to learn skills around marketing and like messaging and sales.
Such a cool background. One of my really close friends also came up in the music industry and is now a business coach. So I think that so many of those life experiences make you a better, especially what you do now, like teaching creatives how to market themselves. I think so much of your background really probably brings in a unique lens that they're learning from you in a way that if you didn't have that experience, you might not think about marketing the same way, especially being from a different industry. I think that's a huge strength and advantage that I always encourage people to try to get outside of their industry and their bubble whenever possible, because that's where my best ideas come from.
I don't know if you relate to this too, but I feel like the conditioning from corporate world, like the volume of emails I had, the amount of hours I worked, like nothing will ever be as hard as that was. Nothing will ever be as stressful as like working on, you know, a multi-million-dollar tour and putting it on sale with like massive teams across agents and managers and labels and, you know, RT, like nothing will ever be like that big of stakes. So I just feel like it gave me this like resilience conditioning that has been so valuable for creative entrepreneurship. I don't know if you can relate to that being from the corporate world as well.
For myself, unfortunately, no. My corporate job was actually, I'm not going to lie, it felt very easy. Like it was definitely one of those jobs where I felt like I had to find things to fill up the time, or like I'd be assigned something that the project timeline was like 2 weeks, but I knew I could accomplish it in 2 hours. And it was very creativity stifling. I think totally different industries though, so I have very much heard that from friends who work in entertainment or in music industry. Anything that's very fast paced, I think in a lot of ways mirrors startup culture. So I can totally see why that built up resilience in you. I love that though. I love that you have that background. I want to get into this case study because there's so much goodness to uncover today. So just to give our listeners some background. So basically, Kelsey has this program, Launch Your Own Way. It's about a $1,500 offer. And recently, this program was launched in December, January. We'll call that the January launch, and then April, May, so spring. And with this launch, in December, Kelsey launched a private podcast, and this is an 8-episode series. I just want to make sure I got the name right. The Warm Up is the private podcast. To my understanding, Kelsey, this is a paid podcast, right?
Yes. So it was anywhere from $49 to $99, depending on when. I almost gave it its own like mini launch. So depending on when you purchased it. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Between these two launches, your program has made over 6 figures. Congratulations, by the way. That's huge. And 44 of the total students who have enrolled between these two launches came directly from the private podcast. And for a $1,500 offer, that's very significant. So we're going to get into the details of not only the private podcast, but also how these two launches worked in terms of the flow and the structure. So let's first, I think I want to zoom out first and kind of just get a picture of the overall launch. So I was deep diving into some of the dates that you provided. Thank you, by the way, for being so detailed with your dates. Correct me at any point if I missummarized any of this, but from what I could tell, for each launch, you had a 5-day pre-sale available to your waitlist. And then the following week, you would open it to the public and you would have an early B pricing for anyone who bought during that first week of the public launch. And then you would have an additional week after that where the price would actually jump up. And then at the end of that, the program would start. So overall, it was about a 3-week open cart window if you include the pre-sale to the waitlist. Is that right?
Correct. For the live launch, right? Yes.
Okay, awesome. So knowing that, as we're getting in, so this is about a 3-week window where someone could potentially join the program. The first launch, what we're calling the January launch, you actually decided, you had at that point already opened it to the waitlist, and you had already opened it to the early B. And then right around mid-December, so December 11th, I think is what you shared, you decided to launch this private podcast. Why did you decide to do this? What was the strategy behind doing it in the middle of a launch?
I think because the holidays were coming up. So I just know you lose momentum over the holidays, but also you have loads of downtime over the holidays, right? You're just like hanging out with your family, just like trying to fill time over the holidays. So I thought what could be a great way to continue this launch and promotion with something that people can just like listen to on the go, listen to while they're with their families. And that's where the private podcast just became this amazing thing to launch that people could purchase, listen on their own time. And then I could like record all the episodes and also take time off over the holidays. So that was really the reason. It was kind of like a seasonal reason, which ended up being like a really good assumption because I think a lot of people, they were taking time off and they enjoyed that format for learning.
Did you know going into this December/January launch that you were going to do this, like employ a private podcast, or was it kind of a spur of the moment decision? I only ask because I would assume if you had, preemptively decided you were going to do it, that the private podcast would have been available from the very beginning, like even with the wait list. But, obviously it came later. So was this kind of more of an impromptu decision?
Yeah, it was very spur of the moment because I was like, oh, everything's slowing down around the holidays, but this live, so Launch Your Own Way, my program, I teach it live a couple times a year, and that wasn't happening till January. So I was like, I don't want to lose all the momentum over the holidays. What can I kind of do to continue that? So it was very spur of the moment. I always kind of wanted to do something around this idea of the warm up, like what do you do before a launch, right? Because so many people can like put together a whole launch plan, but they haven't actually created like the audience and offer alignment. They haven't actually like engaged their audience enough and built that trust trust for people to actually want to purchase whatever their offer is. So I wanted to create the warm up, so that it could really teach people really simple methods to employ within their businesses before the launch period. So it was kind of like the perfect lead in offer for my offer as well.
And it's really meta too, right? You're teaching about launching and then you're getting to showcase in real time, like, hey, I'm literally doing this with you right now. I'm warming you up through the warm up. And here's how you can experience, I guess, like what you're going to learn. Okay, that's really, really interesting. So this was happening impromptu for you. Like, how did you previously, I guess, sell? What was the main sales mechanism for selling Launch Your Own Way before you had the private podcast? Did you use a webinar? Was it just sending people straight to a sales page? What was the modality through which they were being converted prior to the existence of the warm up?
I feel like because I teach launching, I always like to test new things, and I always like to kind of play around with different possibilities. So in the past, I've done challenges. I've also done, I guess I would call them more workshops than webinars. They're very like hands-on and actionable. I would do quizzes. Like there's just so many things I've tried. So yeah, I would usually do some sort of a freebie actually. Like I've never done a paid thing. So the podcast it's the first like paid, almost like in between, because I had already done a challenge, I believe. Yeah, I had already done a challenge. So then I was like, oh, what can I put like in between that's paid before they purchase? Because I also kind of wanted to like weed out people with buying power. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was like, there's so many people that just like sign up for freebies and then like kind of participate and like kind of don't. I was like, I really want to see like who within my audience has the purchasing power, is really invested in this journey of launching and marketing in their business. And so I wanted it to be paid so that I could almost like really tell who was in my audience that had that.
I think that's so smart. And it's been a long time since we've done really a live launch into any sort of product or program over $1,000, since we retired our coaching program. But I will say, even with our just one-off live workshops, we have found that getting people to pay any amount, even if it's, a dollar amount of their choosing, sometimes we'll even test pay what you want pricing. It totally shows up differently in terms of how, like you said, not even invested in like a monetary way, but just how invested they are in getting the results and learning and consuming the information. I feel like people actually attend live and they implement faster. And so, I mean, as educators, the results that our students get really drive our business forward, right? So obviously anything you can do to increase the transformation that they get and the speed at which they do it, I think makes a whole ton of sense. So love that you use that as a filter. So you've tested a bunch of different modalities. Early hot take, I'm just curious, compared to the prior methods that you've used, challenges, workshops, how does the private podcast stack up in terms of conversion? Would you say it's your favorite one, the best one? Is it about the same? What are your insights?
Yeah, well, since it's paid, it's hard to say, right? Because I almost look at it as a funnel. Like all the freebies are kind of at the top, right? So they're just like bringing a lot of people onto my mailing list and stuff, but obviously not converting as high of a percentage because there's more of them. And also it's free. So I'd say the fact that it was paid, again, you're just segmenting out part of your audience that has purchasing power. And also, yeah, I'd say it's been way more, like the conversion rate's been way higher because not only like were people listening to it in December and converting into the January, a lot of them who listened in December continued to listen and then converted in the next launch. So I think if you're trying to create like a big warm up over a long period of time, it's almost like it will do so much legwork for you far after you create it. Whereas a challenge, it's like the challenge happens and then it goes away, right? Or a webinar, it's like, yeah, you can create a lead magnet for it so it keeps people keep watching it, but they watch it and then they're done and they convert or they don't. I have so many people listening to episodes again and again and again and sending me DMs about how great it is. And I drop new episodes every launch. So it just becomes this amazing sales machine in my business.
So true. That makes a lot of sense. I have like a bunch of questions percolating in my head right now around like why new episodes or like the consumption patterns that you've noticed with people. But before we get into that, let's kind of break down the actual 8-episode structure. So the original version of the private podcast, right? It had 8 episodes, a combination of solo episodes and interviews with past students. Can you share with us like how many of those episodes were your own, recorded by yourself versus ones that featured students? On the ones that featured students, what exactly were you asking them why did you want them on the episodes, and if there was like a certain flow perhaps that you followed with the 8 episodes, if they kind of all stacked up and built a narrative, like an overarching narrative. If you could walk us through that, that would also be super helpful.
Sure. So I think with any private podcast, it's really smart to think about like, what is a short and sweet transformation I can take people through? Like, I wouldn't necessarily do like this ongoing, I mean, you could if you want, but I liked the idea of it being like almost its own little mini course that could exist on its own and had a really specific transformation. And the transformation is by the end of this, you'll have the tools implemented to be engaging your audience and building trust with your audience. So that was kind of the format of it. It was 5 episodes of me recording and giving a training. So I almost took people through that funnel idea, like top of funnel, like let's think about how you're actually bringing people in. How are you like taking them from lukewarm to like more warm, and then how are you like kind of bringing them down the funnel, and then at the end it's like, okay, if you want to convert them, join Launch Your Own Way. So that's like the episode structure, and I take them through like very actionable steps. They're like 10 minutes each, very easy to kind of like listen and learn. And then the interviews are past Launch Your Own Way students, so alumni, talking about how they warmed up people ahead of their really big launches. So yeah, just kind of taking people through what worked, what didn't work, really like candid, fun conversations that are super educational as well, because it's like people who are a little bit closer to the students, right? It was maybe their first time launching. They tried a couple things. They maybe didn't have a super hot audience at the time. So just super, super helpful. And again, like hopefully listening to that, seeing themselves and wanting to purchase. And I also wanted to interview people with different kinds of offers. So not only one-to-many offers, right? But also one-on-one. Like, how do you launch a service? Like, what does that look like? What does a template shop look like? You know, so I wanted to kind of have a variation around that.
Very smart. So 5 of the 8, like you said, short 10-minute actionable trainings. The other 3 were interviews. Did each of those 3 episodes focus on just one past student, or was it like a kind of like a round table compilation of several interviews with different students within one episode?
I like a round table idea. No, it's just one-on-one. It was just like this. But round table maybe in the future.
Yeah, that could be an interesting format to test. And I mean, I love the one-on-one, like deep dive case study style interviews, because you can get all of these juicy details that sometimes you don't have the opportunity to within a group setting. But that would be very interesting to test how different people respond to those different formats. So I want to first share a few stats about the podcast and the listeners' consumption habits with it. So here I see you have shared that so far there's been 330 signups. So 330 people have purchased access to the warm up. And from those 330 people, you've amassed 1,694 downloads and a 36% listen rate. So to my understanding, that's the average listen rate across all the episodes, right?
Yep, that's exactly it.
So, I mean, that's a really excellent, I think, if you're comparing to, let's say, the average watch rate of an evergreen video training. I think 36% is quite like almost 4 out of every 10 people are kind of, you know, listening through all of the episodes. So of the 153 people, this was what I found most interesting. Of the 153 people who listened to 9 episodes or more, 45 of those people converted into customers. So that's like a 30% conversion rate. I'm curious, as these people were listening to these episodes, were you getting any feedback in real time from listeners? Like, were people popping into your DMs and saying, oh, I just listened to episode 3 and, you know, I got this takeaway, or I'm going to try this tip? Or was it kind of more like a one-sided experience for them, and then all of a sudden you just got a notification like so-and-so joined the program?
I got so much interaction with the people who were listening, like more than any other freebie I've ever gotten. Like people posting on their hot girl walks that they're listening to it, people DMing me about how helpful it is. Yeah, loads and loads of feedback, which has been so amazing, because I heard on another podcast, like your voice is like your thumbprint. And getting your voice in people's ears is just like almost building trust at super speed. So, and you probably find this with your own podcast. It's like people get so, it's like that parasocial relationship where you're like, oh, they're talking to me. I feel like that with your podcast. I'm like, I can't believe I'm on here because I love listening to it. So yeah, more than anything I've ever done as like a warm up kind of tactic, it's been incredible feedback, and people still post it all the time. I just shared like 2 people posting it on their walks this week.
That's truly amazing. And I imagine actually that a limited series that's very concentrated on, a specific outcome, like you said, probably initiates that type of engagement even more than a regular weekly episodic series like what we have here on our public podcast. Because, it's kind of, I don't know, like we definitely get interaction from our listeners, and we're so, so grateful anytime someone takes a second to reach out and share an episode, or even just to privately DM us and tell us, how an episode influenced them. But I imagine that for like a short series that the engagement would be much higher. So I'm not surprised to hear that, but it's also really great to hear that there is that level of interaction. It kind of makes me wonder across all of your 8 episodes. So I know you're kind of saying each of the 5 solo episodes that you recorded were kind of walking people through the funnel until the end where you get to the conversion level and you're like, hey, go join, launch your own way. In the other episodes, like episode 1, 2, 3, and even in the ones with the students, what was your call to action at the end of each episode? Was it always consistent, like, hey, go to this link and join our program? Or did you ask people a question and tell them, hey, DM me your answer to this? Like, how were you initiating engagement, if at all, or was it totally organic?
I would tell people to share in every single episode. I told them to tag me so I could share too. So that was definitely a call to action. I love the idea of having them DM me something though. Maybe I'll do that in future episodes. You're giving me so many good marketing. I always say your podcast is like having an MBA. They're like every single episode, you just get so many gems. So that was a good one. And then I also just like really naturally wove in the call to action into Launch Your Own Way into every episode. So it was just like very like, by the way, like if you're interested in hearing more about this, my program Launch Your Own Way is open. The link's in the show notes kind of thing. So I would almost put it like at the beginning-ish of the episode and then again toward the end of the episode.
Okay, so kind of bookending it.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. I think that's actually really great. I know as a listener, I personally, like if I know I'm going to be potentially sold or pitched something, I actually really prefer if someone kind of gives me a heads up about it. It almost like sets the context, I guess, for the conversation that's about to happen or that I'm about to tune into, to understand, okay, we're talking about warm up through the lens of launching, which I can get support for by doing XYZ. So I think that's a great reminder for all our listeners. Don't be afraid to be really upfront at the very beginning. You don't have to save your pitch until the last possible second. You can state it right there up front and invite people that way. The first time you launched this private podcast in December, how did you promote it, Kelsey? Were you blasting this all over to all of your organic channels? Did you put any ad spend behind it? How are people finding out about it?
Yeah, I'm lucky to have a super engaged audience. So I basically always work in public. I like share as I'm doing things. So I was kind of like, I'm launching this. I shared the cover art of it. I would share myself like doing the episodes and kind of build a little wait list around it. And then I gave like an early price to the wait list. That was the $49 that people could get in like super early. And then I had all those CTAs of people sharing. So right when it launched, there were loads of people listening that I would share. I always just like shared my stories. I don't think I ever shared like a feed post. I think it was all through stories and email, which is usually how I sell anyway. No paid ads or anything. But yeah, just posting it often, like giving people a CTA to purchase, having other people share, and then that idea of working in public. So really like actually sharing the process of creating it, I think gets people really engaged and intrigued and wanting to purchase.
I could not agree more. I'm such a huge fan, both as a consumer and as a creator, of the concept of building in public. I just think it's so fascinating to get into the weeds of someone's process and like their real-time experiments. I prefer that, I think, to a fully fleshed out, beautified product. It feels like, to your point, that I have some skin in the game, I guess, in the success of whatever they're building if I'm part of the process. So I love that tip for anyone listening today who's thinking, maybe I want to try something similar for my next launch. Don't feel like you have to have it fully ready to launch before you ever talk about it. Feel free to, even start the idea of what the private podcast might be about and start talking with your audience today about that.
Yeah, and start a wait list and then like have people maybe even vote on polls about like what they want to learn about or what their first episode will be. There's so many ways to like have them as part of the creation process.
Great tip. After you launched it the first time in December and the January open cart closed, you mentioned that there were still people who were listening to it on Evergreen, like in between the January and the April, May launch. Do you like actively continue to promote the private podcast during that window, or was it more so just people who had bought it earlier were catching up and listening to it after the closed cart window?
Yeah, so I would definitely still promote it here and there. People were still sharing it, but I also had it in a funnel, like an email funnel. So if you signed up for a free workshop, then it was almost like a tripwire kind of within that, I guess is the word for it. Although I hate that word. It sounds like you're trying to pull a fast one on someone, but you know what I mean? It's like, it was like kind of tacked on to a freebie. So that converted a lot of people in between, which would then kind of convert people into Launch Your Own Way in between as Evergreen students.
So in between live launches, then you're saying people can still join at their own time at any time.
Yeah, so it's always on Evergreen, but then I'll do a live. It's kind of a hybrid program. Like it's always on Evergreen. There's a membership that's part of it. So you get access to 6 months of like the membership, the marketing membership, and you can watch the replays, but you also get your ticket to the next launch, when the live launch, when you join. And that's when I teach it live. And I'll do that a couple times a year. And I love teaching it live just because launching isn't something that it's ever evolving. People's purchasing habits change. I'm always testing new things. I'm always refining. So I just like love kind of that live energy around teaching it. And I love giving people kind of like my latest learnings around it as well. So I love to kind of keep that as an element. But in between, yes, you can still kind of purchase into it.
No, I think that's so true. Like anything related to marketing, I think is always, I mean, there's some tenets that like never really change about just buyer behavior and buyer psychology, but I think the method in which you present said information can definitely change month to month, year to year. So I love that you still keep your pulse on that. I think that's really important and very beneficial for your students. For the April, May launch, when you went back full force into live launching it this time, because you already had the private podcast ready and made, it was present in that launch from the very beginning. I believe I read somewhere in your case study submission that there was a pre-sale discount or code tied to the private podcast. Am I remembering that correct?
Yeah, I tied it to the private podcast. I tied it to close friends, which we could do a whole nother episode on close friends on Instagram. And it was also tied to the wait list. So kind of if you were like in those pools of people and you hadn't converted previously, you would have gotten kind of like the wait list early B, which was like, is like a private pre-sale that's like an email only kind of pre-sale. Yeah.
What's the discount on the program for that?
I believe it was $300 off.
Yeah, that's pretty significant for a $1,500 offer. Do you like the actual technical mechanics of this? I'm sure some of our listeners who have not produced a private podcast may be wondering this. When you're sharing time sensitive codes, how do you deliver that and then retract it, I guess, when it's no longer applicable? Like if someone's listening on Evergreen, do you leave it in there? Do you re-upload a new file with that piece cut out? Or how are you inserting that kind of time sensitive information into those episodes?
Yeah, so I don't actually put it in the episodes. I do have like a discount code that's like Evergreen in the episodes, but I don't actually put it in there for that very reason. I'm very like, I call myself squiggle brained. Like I would never, like my mind is just like blah, so I just would never remember to do that. But what I do is I have a list of all the people who have downloaded it, who are listening, and I send them emails, like the waitlist pre-sale email funnel that gives them the discount link.
Okay, so it's more of like a back end way of getting them. They're not hearing about it as they're listening or reading it in the show notes at all.
No, they're just getting it via email as being listeners.
That's very cool. Do they know when they purchase the podcast that they are going to be getting an incentive like that? Or is it totally like a surprise and delight strategy there?
I'd say it's surprise and delight. Yeah, I don't necessarily tell them like when the next live is happening or like when I'm launching it. But if they've been following me for a while, they probably know that I always do some sort of a pricing incentive to a wait list. So yeah, I think it's just nice to include them as well for being part of that podcast experience.
I love that. And then you said for the Evergreen people in between launches, they're hearing a certain Evergreen code that's just always present. What is that discount? Is it slightly less than what you offered during live windows?
Yeah, that's $50 off. If you are like listening to the podcast, you just like always get that code. And then if you're on the Evergreen funnel, so if you're like opting into that free workshop that then goes to the private podcast and then into Launch Your Own Way, I think that's actually $200 off. So there's like a lot of different, it depends like where you come in through, I guess. But yeah, the evergreen funnel, you'll like always get $200 off in between launches.
That's nice. And when you are referring to the funnel, I'm assuming like no matter what the opt-in entry point is, the ongoing funnel, so to speak, is I'm assuming like an email sales sequence. Is that?
Yeah, it's like an email funnel. Yeah. I just switched everything over to Shopify and Klaviyo. So I don't have like up-to-date stats on all that stuff. I like literally just got it set up this week, but loads and loads of people go through that funnel. It's like pretty much all the CTAs on my website for the freebie are to that funnel. So it's not as highly converting as I would like. I think there's definitely things I could do to adjust it. I think I would also like to maybe try some ads this year once I have everything up and running in Shopify. But yeah, I find email like one of my best kind of sales channels for sure.
I totally concur with that. I'm right up there with you. Kelsey, to wrap up this case study, I would love to ask you about the thought process behind adding new episodes. You have alluded to this several times in our conversation today that, you know, in the original format, it was 8 episodes that launched in December. And then for the May one, you added in new episodes. These new episodes, are they new interviews with Launch Your Own Way students? Are they new solo episodes? And if so, how does that fit in with like the structure of the first 5 that you originally launched with?
Yeah, it's a mix. Okay, so I added a couple of interview episodes because I just had some awesome case studies I wanted to share between the January and May launch. And then I also added a Q&A episode because there were so many people that had listened that just like sent questions or like were in my DMs. So I wanted to do kind of a Q&A episode, and I think I'll keep doing those because they're quite fun. And then I wanted to add an episode on working in public. That actually hasn't gone live yet. I'm thinking about putting it live with the evergreen funnel that's going live in Klaviyo to kind of do those in conjunction. But I want to do one all about kind of that idea of working in public and how this is like just a great warm-up strategy throughout any kind of launch campaign. So yeah, I think as trainings come up and if I have an idea that like fits well within the curriculum of what I'm teaching in the warm-up and isn't covered in Launch Your Own Way, right? Because I want to make sure they're like very separate kind of trainings, then it's a great thing to kind of drop in there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's really smart to continue to add in new case studies, especially like you said, to show the wide breadth of students that go through your program and how they're seeing success. And the Q&A is super smart too, because I'm sure each cohort of students kind of have their own unique questions that might come up. I guess if I'm playing devil's advocate, like one of the appeals, right, of what you said at the beginning of a limited series podcast is its brevity. The fact that you could potentially, let's say, binge it in a weekend and it has kind of like a finite end. Do you plan to continue adding new episodes every launch? And if so, at what point do you feel like you would want to cap it so that it doesn't become like let's say someone 7 launches down the line, downloads this private podcast and there's like 50 episodes now sitting in the library. Do you feel like that would impact its effectiveness at all?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I definitely want to keep it short and sweet. I don't know if I'm going to keep adding to it every single launch. I do see myself maybe updating the episodes in the future, like re-recording or just freshening them up the same way that I do with the Launch Your Own Way program every couple of months, because I think, you learn and you grow and you have kind of new perspectives on things. But yeah, I think I'll definitely keep it kind of no more than like 15-ish episodes. It's at 12 right now. So I can see myself kind of capping it there. It is a great idea for a series, but I just don't want to put myself on the hook for having to deliver consistent content in that format quite yet. I think I just have too many other ideas and things that I want to do. And that's one of the things that keeps me away from doing like a public podcast, because I admire you so much for always putting out episodes, but I think I would have a hard time with the consistency of it.
It is difficult. I'm not going to lie. Like we're 5 years into it and it doesn't necessarily get easier. I would say it really is an act of discipline. But I will say, I think it's really smart what you're doing in terms of how you're approaching this, because I feel like, again, like listening to a private podcast for a very specific reason, I do appreciate the brevity of something. So like how you formatted it in such a concise way, I think is part of why it is effective. So for our listeners, by the way, I'm a huge believer that the best way to learn is by literally experiencing said things. So if you're at the end of this case study thinking, okay, I kind of get the concept of what Kelsey's sharing, but I want to like really dive deeper into this, download the podcast and like literally go through it. And I think you'll get even more takeaways as you're listening and then comparing it to what like Kelsey is sharing here behind the scenes. So Kelsey, where can people go and download the podcast?
Well, my new Shopify site, which I will give you the kind of like direct link to, but it's cominguproses.co, is my new Shopify site, and have a click around. It was a big, big project moving. It felt like moving a house. I don't know how many times you've had to build a new website, but it is just, I feel like I have nothing left inside of me right now.
Well, thank you for showing up today because I totally get what you mean. Like that side of business is really not my favorite thing. And so it's a Herculean task. Congratulations for completing it. Where else besides your website, which we will include in the show notes. So if you want to check out the warm up, the private podcast, or anything else Kelsey's doing, you can go look below. But where else can people connect with you, Kelsey?
Well, I'm a millennial girly, so I'm always on Instagram. That's where I live. That's where my business lives. If you want to say what up, like slide into my DMs. I also have a marketing close friend. So if you're interested in any of these conversations around podcasts or other data around launching, Q&As around launching, like that's where I'm hanging out kind of with a group of about 500 people who are really opting into close friends and wanting to learn more about marketing.
So smart. I know you're really enticing me. I feel like now I have to have you back on to talk about the close friends piece. We'll have to do
It is so good.
We'll have to do a part 2. Yes.
I would love that.
That would be so much fun. Kelsey, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today and all of your data. For all of you listening in, make sure you go say hi to Kelsey, give her a thank you, tell her what part of this episode stood out to you the most. You don't know how much that means to us as creators. It really does make a difference when you take the time out of your day to share, even privately, not even, something you have to post publicly, but we love to hear from listeners what they're getting away from each episode. Also, if you are thinking about starting a private podcast, I did want to plug this in. Kelsey mentioned she used Hello Audio. Shout out to Lindsay Padilla, the founder of that platform. Awesome platform. Highly recommend looking into it. Or if you're already using Kajabi or are wanting to host things all in one place, we use Kajabi for our private podcast. So if you want to try that out for yourself, we have a 30-day free trial link that I will link below. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We will catch you in the next episode.
Bye. Thanks so much.